The Pacific Ocean, 1942. The Empire of Japan stood at the height of its power. From the jungles of Burma to the coral islands of the South Pacific, the rising sun flew unchallenged. 6 months earlier, Japanese carrier planes had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision, sinking battleships, crippling the Pacific Fleet, and leaving the world stunned. To the Imperial Navy, the war seemed already won. Japan's admirals, confident and proud, saw their carriers as invincible instruments of destiny. Their fleet, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented years of planning, training, and discipline. Every pilot had been molded into a weapon, honed by combat in China and the early Pacific victories. In Tokyo, the High Command believed America would never recover. They mocked the U.S. as soft, divided, and unprepared for the long war that lay ahead. In their war rooms, they spoke of a decisive battle, a single clash that would destroy what remained of the American fleet once and for all. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States Navy licked its wounds but did not break. Shipyards worked around the clock. New carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, emerged from dry dock faster than anyone thought possible. Pilots trained endlessly, mechanics rebuilt engines, and cryptanalysts in dimly lit rooms began to unravel the Japanese Navy's most secret communications. But Japan didn't know that yet. To the men aboard the Imperial Fleet, the war was a series of glorious victories. Wake Island, Malaya, the Philippines. They had never faced defeat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, now turned his gaze toward a small, isolated atoll in the middle of the Pacific, Midway. He believed capturing it would lure the weakened Americans into a final trap. The plan was elegant, precise, and devastating, or so it seemed. From their command bridges, Japanese admirals watched the sunrise glitter across their steel decks, unaware that fate was already shifting against them. Because in the quiet, shadowy corners of a U.S. Navy intelligence office, a handful of codebreakers had cracked their plan wide open. The trap was set, but not the one Japan expected. In April 1942, just 4 months after the devastation of Pearl Harbor, America struck back, not with overwhelming force, but with audacity. 16 B-25 bombers, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, launched from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, bound for Tokyo itself. It was a mission no one believed possible. The bombers weren't designed for carrier takeoffs, and the distance was almost suicidal. Yet one by one, they lifted into the wind, rising from the pitching deck into stormy skies. For the first time since the war began, the Japanese homeland was about to feel what they had inflicted on others. The raid did little physical damage, a few factories, some fires, but its psychological impact was thunderous. Japan's leaders were humiliated. Civilians who once thought themselves untouchable now looked skyward in fear. And Admiral Yamamoto, the proud commander of the combined fleet, burned with a desire for revenge. He was determined to crush the American carriers that had dared approach his homeland. But he didn't know that his fury would lead him straight into the battle that would doom his fleet. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, the Doolittle raid lit a spark of hope. Across the Navy, morale soared. The message was clear: America was not beaten. The men who had watched their ships sink in December now worked with renewed purpose. Factories produced aircraft faster than ever. Engineers improved torpedoes, and pilots trained to fight the kind of war Japan had never imagined, one fought in the air and across endless ocean. By early May, the U.S. Navy proved it could fight back on equal terms at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Though technically a draw, it was a strategic win. Japan's advance toward Australia was halted, and their carrier Shokaku was damaged, while Zuikaku lost many pilots. For the first time, Japanese admirals hesitated. The Americans were learning, adapting. But Yamamoto's pride demanded a final, crushing statement. He would set a trap near Midway Island to annihilate the remaining U.S. carriers once and for all. He believed he held every advantage: Numbers, experience, confidence. What he didn't know was that his enemy already knew where and when he would strike. The silent war of intelligence had just turned deadly. In the spring of 1942, deep inside a nondescript building at Pearl Harbor, a small team of U.S. Navy intelligence officers worked tirelessly, surrounded by stacks of coded messages and maps. Their mission: to break the unbreakable, JN-25, Japan's top-secret naval communication code. Among them was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a quiet, brilliant man in a Hawaiian robe and slippers who lived on coffee and cigarettes. His team, known as Station Hypo, had spent months piecing together fragments of messages intercepted from Japanese transmissions. They worked day and night, trying to understand where Japan would strike next. Then, a word began appearing repeatedly in the decrypted messages: AF. It was clear that AF was Japan's next target, but what did it mean? Washington thought it might be the Aleutian Islands. Others suspected somewhere near Australia. But Rochefort and his men had a hunch. AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny U.S. outpost roughly halfway between Asia and North America. To prove it, they devised a clever test. They sent a fake, unencrypted message from Midway reporting that its water supply was running low. 2 days later, Japan's coded transmissions reported that AF is short on water. The codebreakers had done it. The Japanese trap was revealed, and now the Americans would be the ones lying in wait. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, moved swiftly. He gathered every available ship, plane, and pilot. The carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, still scarred from the Coral Sea, steamed toward a point northeast of Midway. Nimitz was calm, methodical, and utterly determined. He knew the Japanese still outnumbered him, but he also knew something they didn't: exactly when and where they would strike. In Tokyo, Yamamoto's confidence grew. He believed the Americans were broken, their fleet hiding in fear. His plan was precise: a feint toward Alaska to draw U.S. forces north, then a sudden, overwhelming strike on Midway. Once the Americans rushed in to defend it, his carriers would destroy them. It was a masterstroke, on paper. But in reality, Yamamoto was sailing straight into the jaws of an ambush. As the Japanese fleet moved east, the Pacific grew silent, the calm before one of the greatest naval battles in history. By late May 1942, the chessboard of the Pacific was set. Admiral Yamamoto commanded the largest and most powerful naval force ever assembled by Japan, a combined armada stretching hundreds of miles across open ocean. His goal was clear: capture Midway Atoll, lure out America's remaining carriers, and annihilate them. His confidence was absolute. To him and his staff, the Americans were predictable, cautious, and still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Their fleet, Yamamoto believed, would rush blindly to defend Midway, straight into his trap. But Admiral Chester Nimitz knew better. Using the decrypted intelligence from Station Hypo, Nimitz turned Yamamoto's plan against him. Instead of charging headlong, he placed his own carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, hidden northeast of Midway, just beyond the Japanese line of sight. Their orders: wait, watch, and strike first. It was a gamble. 3 American carriers against 4 of Japan's most elite: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. On paper, the odds were grim. But Nimitz trusted his intelligence, his men, and the element of surprise. On Midway itself, Marines and Navy personnel prepared for invasion. Runways were lined with fighters and bombers, anti-aircraft guns manned, and radar stations scanned the horizon. The atoll, barely large enough to walk across in an hour, became a fortress in the middle of nowhere. Meanwhile, Japanese reconnaissance was failing. Their scouts missed the American carriers entirely, a crucial oversight that would cost them dearly. They believed the U.S. Navy was still far to the south, nowhere near the battle zone. On the American ships, tension was electric. Sailors worked in silence, refueling planes, checking weapons, and staring out at the endless blue horizon. Pilots sat in ready rooms, listening to briefings, tracing routes on maps, and waiting for the order they knew would come soon: launch all planes. Far above, weather conditions shifted, clouds forming, winds changing, small invisible factors that would soon decide the fate of nations. As night fell on June 3rd, the ocean seemed calm, almost peaceful. But beneath the surface, thousands of men, Japanese and American alike, knew what awaited them at dawn. The trap was ready on both sides. Only one would spring it first. June 3rd, 1942. The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast, silent expanse hiding two powerful fleets that could not see each other. The air was heavy, the horizon hazy. For the thousands of men aboard ships and on the small coral strip called Midway, it was a waiting game. Everyone knew the storm was coming. No one knew when it would break. On Midway Atoll, Marines scanned the skies, their eyes burning from the glare. Aircraft were lined wing to wing on the narrow runways. Mechanics worked feverishly under the blazing sun, reloading bombs, checking fuel lines, tightening bolts. The tiny island buzzed with tension, part airbase, part fortress. Inside the command bunker, officers studied radar screens, pencils tapping nervously. Every blip, every echo on the radar meant possible death. The men smoked cigarettes down to the filters, their hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. Far out to sea, aboard the USS Enterprise, pilots of Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6 sat quietly in their ready rooms. Some wrote last letters home. Others joked nervously, trying to mask their anxiety. They knew the odds. The Japanese were coming with 4 carriers, more planes, more experience, and better numbers. But the Americans had one weapon the enemy didn't: surprise. Above them, deck crews worked like a machine. Men in colored jerseys, yellow for directors, green for catapults, purple for fuel, red for ordnance, moved in perfect rhythm. The flight deck was a living organism, alive with motion, sound, and danger. At midnight, the ocean was calm, almost unnaturally so. The only sound was the slow thrum of engines and the slap of waves against steel hulls. In the dim glow of red lights, sailors whispered in the corridors, sharing cigarettes, prayers, and dark humor. Everyone was thinking the same thing: tomorrow it begins. In the distance, the Japanese fleet advanced, 200 aircraft, carriers gleaming under moonlight, destroyers cutting through the waves like knives. Their commanders were confident. The Americans, they believed, would be caught unprepared, their ships destroyed before they could even launch. But as dawn approached, the quiet veil of the Pacific began to lift. The first reconnaissance planes took off from Midway, heading west into the sunrise. They would soon spot something that would ignite one of the greatest battles in naval history. June 4th, 1942, 4:30 a.m. The sky above Midway began to pale with the first light of dawn. A soft orange glow stretched across the horizon, illuminating the calm sea. But the peace lasted only minutes. The first American patrol planes spotted something on the water, a massive fleet bearing east. The call went out across the radios: many enemy ships heading Midway. The moment of truth had arrived. On the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge, confident and composed. His first wave of aircraft, 108 planes strong, roared off the decks, streaking toward Midway like a swarm of hornets. Bombers, dive bombers, and fighters climbed into formation, their engines echoing across the ocean. Minutes later, radar operators on Midway picked up the incoming wave. Alarms blared across the island. Air raid warning! Air raid warning! Enemy planes inbound! Marines sprinted to their stations. Anti-aircraft crews loaded shells. Pilots rushed to their fighters, old Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcats, machines inferior to the Japanese Zeros, but flown by men with iron nerves. As the first Japanese bombs fell, the atoll erupted in fire and smoke.
Hangars exploded, fuel tanks burst, and the air was filled with the sound of screaming engines and shattering glass. Yet through the chaos, Midway's defenders fought back fiercely. Anti-aircraft guns spat fiery tracers into the sky, and several bombers fell burning into the sea. Amid the smoke, the surviving American bombers took off from the battered airfield. B-26 Marauders, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and TBF Avengers, heading west toward the Japanese fleet. Their mission: find the carriers and strike back. But it was a slaughter. Most never made it back. Japanese Zeros ripped through the formations, and anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Planes fell one by one, their crews vanishing into the ocean. On Nagamo's bridge, officers reported the attack's success. Midway's airfield heavily damaged, its defenses weakened. The admiral ordered his planes rearmed for a second strike. But at that same moment, reports arrived of American ships nearby. The decision Nagamo made next would seal his fate. As his crews rushed to switch bombs for torpedoes, his flight decks became chaos. Fueled planes, armed torpedoes, and open hangars full of explosives. The Americans were coming, and his carriers were most vulnerable right now.
June 4th, 1942, 10:20 a.m. For hours, the battle raged unseen across hundreds of miles of ocean. American squadrons launched from their carriers at dawn, searching desperately for the Japanese fleet. Many never found it. Others ran out of fuel and ditched in the sea. Communication was scattered, navigation primitive. The Pacific was too vast, and the enemy fleet too well hidden. By mid-morning, the first American torpedo squadrons finally reached the Japanese carriers and met disaster. One after another, torpedo squadrons 8, 6, and 3 dove low to release their weapons. They flew straight and level into a storm of anti-aircraft fire and Zero fighters. Not one torpedo hit its target. Of the 41 planes that attacked, 35 were shot down. Many crews never had a chance to bail out. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. As the Japanese fighters dove low to destroy the torpedo planes, the sky above them was suddenly empty, leaving their carriers exposed. At that exact moment, high in the clouds, another group of American aircraft appeared, the dive bombers of Enterprise and Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey. McCluskey's squadron had been lost, nearly out of fuel. Then, by sheer luck and instinct, he spotted the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer racing north, a ship trying to rejoin the fleet. He followed it, straight to the heart of Nagumo's armada. Through gaps in the clouds, the American pilots finally saw them. 4 massive Japanese carriers, their decks cluttered with refueling planes, torpedoes, and bombs. It was a scene of chaos waiting to ignite. McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio. "We found the enemy! Attack! Attack! Attack!" The dive bombers rolled over and plunged toward the sea, one after another. The air screamed. Sunlight flashed off canopies. Below, the Japanese lookouts shouted, "Too late." At 10:22 a.m., the first bombs struck. A single hit on Kaga tore through the flight deck, igniting fuel lines and detonating munitions. Moments later, Akagi was hit. One bomb penetrated straight into her hangar. Within minutes, both ships were engulfed in towering fireballs. In less than 5 minutes, the pride of the Imperial Navy was burning. The Americans had turned disaster into destiny. June 4th, 1942. Midway Atoll, Pacific Ocean. The sky was on fire. Black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, twisting into the heavens like a dark storm. Below, the Japanese fleet burned. Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, 3 of the Imperial Navy's proudest carriers, were nothing but floating infernos. The sudden attack had hit them at the worst possible moment. Their decks were packed with fully fueled aircraft, armed with torpedoes and bombs meant for a second strike.
The U.S. dive bombers hadn't just damaged the carriers, they'd turned them into explosions waiting to happen. Sailors scrambled to fight the flames. Buckets of water, fire hoses, even sandbags. It was useless. The heat melted steel. Planes disintegrated where they sat. Bombs and torpedoes cooked off one by one, ripping open the decks like paper. Men dove into the sea to escape the inferno, only to find the ocean itself slick with burning fuel. From above, the American pilots could only watch in stunned silence. Some who had doubted their own luck or skill realized what they had done. They had crippled Japan's mightiest weapons in minutes. But the battle wasn't over. One Japanese carrier, Hiru, had survived. While her sister ships burned, Hiru's crew prepared a counterattack. Her flight deck, somehow untouched, came alive with motion. Pilots sprinted to their planes. Mechanics loaded torpedoes. The order was clear: avenge the fleet. Within an hour, Hiru's dive bombers were in the air, heading straight for the American carriers that had struck the devastating blow. At 12 noon, they found their target, the USS Yorktown. Out of the sun they came, diving fast and hard. Alarms blared. Gunners opened fire. The sea erupted in splashes of shrapnel and flame. 2 bombs hit home, one crashing through Yorktown's flight deck, another exploding deep below. Power failed. The ship went dead in the water. But the Yorktown's crew refused to give up. Fires were contained, power restored. Within an hour, she was operational again. Then came the second wave. At 2:45 p.m., Japanese torpedo bombers struck. 2 more hits ripped open her side. The Yorktown listed hard to port. Captain Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. The ocean that morning had belonged to Japan. By afternoon, it burned for America.
The sea was chaos. By late afternoon on June 4, 1942, the balance of power in the Pacific hung by a thread. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were gone, smoldering ruins beneath thick columns of smoke. Only Hiryu remained, the last sword in Admiral Nagumo's once invincible fleet. But the Americans weren't finished either. Despite losing the Yorktown, they still had their own teeth, Enterprise and Hornet, and now they knew exactly where Hiryu was. On the deck of the Enterprise, the air was electric. Mechanics fueled planes, loaders heaved heavy 1,000-pound bombs onto carts, and pilots crouched in briefing rooms studying photos of the target. They knew this next strike could decide the entire battle. Among them was Lieutenant Dick Best, a man whose calm under pressure had already become legend. His voice crackled over the radio. "Let's finish this." At 5 p.m., 2 squadrons of dauntless dive bombers roared off the deck, rising into the fading light. The Pacific sun was sinking low, turning the clouds gold and crimson. Somewhere ahead, Hiryu steamed eastward, desperate, hunted, still dangerous. When the American formation finally sighted her, Hiryu was already launching her next wave of planes. They caught her mid-launch, a fatal mistake. As the first Dauntless dove, anti-aircraft guns opened up. Tracers streaked through the air like molten sparks. The bombers dropped, one after another, in near-vertical dives. The horizon spun. The carrier's red circle grew larger in the pilot's sights. At 14,000 feet, release. A 1,000-pound bomb sliced through the deck, then another, and another. In seconds, Hiryu erupted in flames. The explosion lifted debris hundreds of feet high, scattering wreckage across the ocean. Planes that hadn't even taken off yet were engulfed in the inferno. Within minutes, the last of Japan's carriers was finished. Admiral Nagumo, watching from his flagship, could only stare at the rising smoke. His proud fleet, 4 carriers strong that morning, was gone. That night, Hiryu's surviving crew abandoned ship. The burning hulk drifted until dawn, when Japanese destroyers scuttled her to the deep. The mighty Kido Butai, the strike force that had terrorized the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon, no longer existed. At Midway, in just one day, the hunters had become the hunted. The morning after the Battle of Midway was eerily quiet. The sea that had boiled with fire and steel now shimmered with oil slicks and drifting debris. Thousands of men, American and Japanese alike, were gone beneath the waves. But above that silent ocean, history had shifted forever. For months, the Japanese Navy had been untouchable. Their victories swept from the Philippines to Singapore, from the Indian Ocean to the Solomon Islands. Their pilots were elite, their carriers unstoppable, their admirals confident, too confident. Admiral Yamamoto had planned Midway as a trap, a crushing blow to finish the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Instead, it became Japan's downfall. 4 of Japan's 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay at the bottom of the Pacific, along with over 3,000 sailors and irreplaceable veteran pilots. In contrast, the U.S. had lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, but saved an entire ocean's worth of morale. When word of the victory reached Washington, Admiral Nimitz sent a simple, understated message: "Pearl Harbor has been avenged." But the significance went far beyond revenge. Midway was more than a naval battle. It was a turning point. For the first time since the war began, the Japanese advance was stopped cold. The Imperial Navy would never again regain its momentum. In the months that followed, American industry roared to life. New carriers like Essex and Intrepid rolled off the docks. New planes like the Hellcat and Avenger filled the skies. And the young, green American pilots, those who had once been terrified rookies, were now veterans forged in the crucible of Midway. By contrast, Japan's best aviators were gone, lost in that fiery day north of Midway Atoll. Their replacements would never match their skill or experience. Every new battle, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, would remind Japan of that loss. Midway proved that wars aren't just won by weapons, they're won by information, timing, and courage. The Americans had all 3. As the sun set over the calm Pacific that June evening, Admiral Nimitz looked over the horizon and said to his staff, "This is only the beginning." And he was right. From that day forward, the tide of the Pacific War flowed one way, east to west, straight toward Tokyo. The laughter of Japan's admirals had faded, replaced by the distant rumble of approaching victory.